Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I have to tell you a sort of funny story about Risa, who is my now 11-year-old niece, but who was on the podcast over the summer. You may recall if you've been listening for a while. She has started answering the phone, yo, 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 cheerio, this is Risa. And for some reason that occurred to me today, and just made me laugh because I was like, I wonder what people would think if I just suddenly started opening the podcast with yo, 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 cheerio, this is Sarah. I couldn't do that to Risa. I wouldn't take her catchphrase, although I have started replying yo, 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 cheerio, this is Risa's aunt when she answers the phone that way. I don't know, that just popped into my head and it made me smile. I hope that something has made you smile today. It's Friday, so hopefully you've got something fun planned for the weekend. My husband woke up in a Christmas mood this morning. He was like, today we are putting up lights. We're doing the outside. And so we started decorating the outside of our house. We haven't put up outside lights in, we moved to this house 3 years ago, and we haven't put up outside lights here. So I don't know. He woke up very Christmassy today. He's usually very Christmassy, but for a variety of reasons, we haven't put up outside lights. Today was the day we got started. I think it'll be an ongoing process over the weekend. He'll be doing outside lights. I'll be decorating inside, and we will go from there. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, at least at our house, because it does not ever look like Christmas where we live in terms of weather, and that's okay. Also, in terms of weather, I'm speaking to author Ashley Winstead today, and she is from the Houston area, so it does not ever look a lot like Christmas weather-wise for her. That was a terrible segue, but I tried. Also, another interesting tidbit that occurred to me today was that both of the authors that I interviewed this week, Ashley on today's episode and Brenda Marie Smith on Tuesday's episode, are from Texas. Brenda is in the Austin area, Ashley is in the Houston area, so it's a Texas-themed author week this week. Kind of fun. Always those fun little coincidences when it comes to the scheduling of these interviews. At any rate, Ashley is here today to talk about her debut novel. The book is called In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. It is a psychological thriller, and let me give you the description. 6 friends, 1 college reunion, 1 unsolved murder. 10 years after graduation, Jessica Miller has planned her triumphant return to Southern elite Duquesne University, down to the envious whispers that are sure to follow in her wake. Everyone is going to see the girl she wants them to see. Confident, beautiful, indifferent. Not the girl she was when she left campus, back when Heather Shelby's murder fractured everything, including the tight bond linking the 6 friends she'd been closest to since freshman year. But not everyone is ready to move on. Not everyone left Duquesne 10 years ago, and not everyone can let Heather's murder go unsolved. Someone is determined to trap the real killer, to make the guilty pay. When the 6 friends are reunited, they will be forced to confront what happened that night, and the year's worth of secrets each of them would do anything to keep hidden. Told in racing dual timelines with a dark campus setting and a darker look at friendship, love, obsession, and ambition, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife is an addictive, propulsive read you won't be able to put down. And so that is the description of In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. Again, the author is Ashley Winstead, and this is definitely a page-turner. From the very first opening scene where we meet Jessica and we start to get a very clear understanding of who she is and what she wants out of this particular reunion, because she has very clear goals for herself, and she's had very clear goals for herself in the 10 years. She wants to go back to the university that she graduated as this person that she has spent 10 years turning herself into. She wants people to notice her. She wants people to recognize her from her time in college, but also now recognize the person that she has become, this very carefully honed image of herself. But as often in life, and definitely in psychological thrillers, things do not go to plan, and the weekend that she is hoping to have does not come to fruition. As you heard in the description, someone wants to expose the murderer, of Heather's murderer, that someone was convicted back when they were in college of that murder, but was never, not convicted, but was arrested, but never convicted of that murder. So there's a lot going on here. I mean, you've got these 7 friends, the East House 7, one of whom is murdered. Heather is murdered. And this very, very close-knit group of friends. And yet, despite how close they are, they all have their secrets. They all have their... There's a lot of undercurrents in this group. And those undercurrents come into play during their time together, but they really start coming out when they come back for their 10-year reunion, and this orchestrator is trying to solve Heather's murder, and everything starts coming to light. All the secrets they are keeping from one another, all the secrets they were keeping from one another in college start coming to light. And it's just this very fast-paced boom, boom, boom. Here's, you'll have the dual timeline. So you'll be in the present at the reunion, and the group will be talking about what happened, and then that will trigger a memory or a story, and you'll go back to the timeline 10 years prior and talk. The scene will describe whatever memory has been brought up, and so it's back and forth, fast-paced, a lot of layers. And I'm going to stop babbling so that Ashley can talk about her book instead of me. So again, the book is called In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. The author is Ashley Winstead. Let's go ahead and get to that interview. Hi, Ashley. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I am excited to have you here. We are going to be talking about your debut novel, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. But before we get to that very intriguing title, could you please give a little bit, a bit of a bio about yourself?
Sure. Yes. So this is my debut book, but I have been trying to be a writer for a solid decade now. And in the meantime, I've had a kind of colorful career, bounced around, have worked in the music industry, the entertainment industry, advertising, politics, philanthropy. So I've kind of dabbled in a lot of different things, and I've taken that approach to my writing. So I write thrillers and also romance, and we'll see what other genres I can convince and persuade my agent to let me try in the future. But I live here in Houston, Texas right now with my husband and 2 cats, and a house full of red wine, which I collect.
That's great. Most people expect that sentence to end with "in a house full of dogs or cats" or something else. And instead of red wine, everyone needs a hobby.
Yes, and I'm very serious about that
one. So again, the book is called In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. And this actually, I was commenting on somebody else's post on TikTok. They were talking about your book. And my comment was, this book made me feel much better about my mundane college experience. I'm cool with the fact that my college experience was pretty mundane. So
it was light on murder. Yes, that's a good thing.
Yes. Can you give an overview of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife is a dark academic thriller, psychological thriller, and it follows 6 friends as they go back to their 10-year college reunion weekend. And so these friends, it's a dual timeline, and in the present, they are all in their early 30s, going back to their alma mater. And the thing that's unique about this group of friends is that back in college, they were the group. They were infamous on campus. They were known as the East House Seven. And their infamy at first was for very positive reasons. But towards the end of their collegiate experiences, it became for a very tragic one. And that is that their senior year of college, one of the friends in the group, a girl named Heather Shelby, who is absolutely the golden girl, was found brutally murdered. And another friend in their group was accused but never convicted of the crime. So 10 years later, at this reunion, Heather's murder remains unsolved. Everyone suspects that it was actually the friend who wasn't able to be convicted, that he just got away with it. But there's still a lot of lingering questions. But again, it's been a decade, so people have tried to move on. They're all coming back for what they think is going to be this really fun, nostalgic weekend. I mean, college was the place for these people where they formed the strongest relationships of their lives, people they were in romantic relationships with, their best friends. So they're coming back. With a ton of agendas, none more ambitious than our main character, Jessica Miller, who has spent the 10 years since she graduated feverishly working to turn herself into a person of value, a person whose life looks like all of her classmates did, all of her wealthy, privileged classmates. So she's determined to come back and have a triumph of kind of showing who she's turned into. But unfortunately for Jessica and all of her friends, someone else has plans for homecoming weekend. Someone has actually orchestrated the weekend, taking advantage of the fact that they're all finally back together in one place to essentially entrap them and unravel years and years worth of closely held secrets and get to the truth about what happened the night that Heather Shelby died and who actually killed her.
Yeah, a couple of comments. One, I think that 10-year reunion tends to be exactly what you were just describing, that it's been 10 years, I'm going to go and show what I've done, kind of prove myself. Whereas, and I'm going to show my age here, the 20-year is more like, I don't care so much. I'm pretty relaxed and I'm happy with myself. But this one definitely has those proving elements. And then the fact that the person that you just mentioned who kind of created the weekend to entrap these six characters, these characters, excuse me, that's just, that's such an impressive amount of planning, even for a fictional character, to get the job, to be able to do all of that, to create this specific weekend. I'm not sure I'm that forward thinking.
Yes. Well, I had to become very forward thinking with writing the plot of this book. Creating all of that for that character.
Yeah. What was your initial inspiration for the book?
There were two things really, and I love what you said about the 10-year college reunion, because that was definitely my experience. And I actually went to my own 10-year college reunion, I would say probably like 6 months ahead of even first dreaming the idea for this book. And just a tiny snippet, I was in love with my college experience. I was a first-generation college student who was able to go to college on a scholarship. And so, and I went to a school with a very large endowment, and there was a lot of wealth there. And so I had a similar experience to what I portrayed for Jessica, that of just being let in for the first time to like what felt like this whole different world where things worked differently and people were just had such different lives than I was used to. And just that feeling of constantly grading inferiority and comparison, which, takes a while, but to grapple with. But with all of that said, on the flip side, college was also the most magical place for me. It's like I expected it to be the place where my life began. And it was. And I was so excited to go back for my 10-year reunion. And I really, truly felt naively that I would feel that same spark. And it would be a similar experience to having been there. And I got there and it fell so flat for me. Nothing was as fun as I remember it being. It was like the wine wasn't sweet enough, the food wasn't as flavorful as I remembered. And I just had this experience of real profound disappointment, and then having to reflect to myself, about why I had so many expectations hung on this weekend, and why I had mythologized college so much. And so I really didn't figure it out that weekend. It was just something that was in my head. And then fast forward months later, and I think I mentioned that I had been working for a long time, really ever since college, to be a writer, to publish a novel. And it had many, many setbacks, some devastating. I actually put writing aside and didn't write for 10 years because I was so gutted by failure early on. And I had recently started returning to writing. And I had written a book. It was a contemporary YA fantasy. And I'd actually gotten into Pitch Wars, the mentoring program for unagented writers, with this book. And so I won't go into Pitch Wars, but essentially the essential information is that it culminates when you're done revising your book with your mentor writers. It culminates in an agent showcase, which is this really big, public, high profile thing where all the writers put their snippets of their books up and their pitches, and agents come and bid on it. And Pitch Wars is it's kind of like the golden ticket. I felt to myself that after so many years, I was so close to actually being able to make writing a reality. And then, of course, I just crashed and burned in the agent showcase and had very little agent attention, quick rejections on the attention that I did get. And I think it hit me so hard because it was public, and because I had formed such fast friendships with the other mentees and wonderful things were happening for them. And I felt so sick inside that I was so consumed by jealousy that I couldn't be genuinely happy. And that's such a shameful thing to admit. And I feel like red-faced even admitting it now. And I knew I couldn't tell anyone that because, again, that's ugly. So I had this night where, dark night of the soul, I told myself, you get one night to wallow, and then you're going to wake up the next morning and you're going to pick yourself up and you're just going to swallow it and do the adult thing and move on. And so I picked up my bottle of red wine from my collection. I, lay it out on the couch with the lights off, and I just kind of sank into my feelings of sadness and grief. And instead of moving on, or I just started to channel, and I started to think, what would it look like if there was a person who could not abide failure, who could not swallow it and move on like a normal adjusted person, but who instead, so formed her identity based on what the world thought of her and how the world received her, that it was essential that she do whatever it took to kind of reorder the world and insist upon people viewing her the way that she viewed herself. And I started to think about all the dark things that a person like that could and would do. And so Jessica Miller, my main character, really vividly kind of sprung into my mind. And the first time I saw her in my imagination was this image of her looking at her face in the mirror, at her reflection, and searching for flaws, and being glad there were none too many. She'd worked hard to make sure there wasn't. And so that scene actually became part of the book in chapter 1. And from there, once I had Jessica, the rest of the book, it just flowed and came together so quickly. It was like I wrote it almost in a fugue state, and it just poured out of me. But yeah, those things, like my own college 10-year reunion, and that experience with kind of profound failure came together, and I just saw the story.
Never underestimate the power of grief and red wine.
Yes, exactly. That's a frequent alchemical combination for me.
And I don't mean to make light of it, but I just mean that it's wonderful that something came out of that you created this book and this work out of that seeming failure.
Oh yes, it feels very powerful for me to make light of it now. Like,
right.
I've mastered it. I'm okay. I'm on the other side.
It's time for our first break of the podcast, now that you know a little bit more about the book and the storyline, as well as where this story came from, the very deeply personal place that it came from in Ashley's life. So when we come back, we'll be talking more about Jessica as the main character and what about her will or will not resonate with readers. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Ashley Winstead about her debut novel, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. Let's return to that interview. Can you talk a little bit more about Jessica, and what about her do you think might resonate with readers? She's not always the easiest character to like, but I think there's so many things about her that can resonate.
Yeah. What a complicated person. And, Jessica, like all fictional characters, suffers the misfortune of people being able to look inside her head and see her thoughts, every minute. And if we all suffered the same fate, I don't know if we could all claim to be the good people.
Yeah.
People's reactions and readers' reactions to Jessica have been really endlessly fascinating to me. I mean, I'll put it right out there. She is an unlikable woman. I guess you could clarify. I say that as someone who likes Jessica very much and feels a lot of empathy for her. And I swear it's not because she's a self-insert, despite the story I just told you about how she popped into my head. She took on a life of her own. But I drew Jessica up and first started to imagine her really as a way to be transparent in an almost white hot, uncomfortable, discomforting way about thoughts that I truly suspected we all have had from time to time. And so I knew that she would be kind of a lightning rod for criticism, but I also felt very deeply committed to my main character being a very complicated person who, as much as she desperately wants to be liked, I didn't need her to be liked. I just, wanted her to be real and compelling and in all of her flaws. So Jessica, I would say, learned at an early age, I think misunderstood at an early age that life is a meritocracy and that you get back what you earn. And this, I think this sort of belief system in a lot of ways is something we've all heard and maybe even ascribed to, maybe even still, but it can be a really toxic sort of belief system because, especially for Jessica, the logic of it is when you fail, that's a reflection on your value. That says something about you, not about the circumstances or the context as much, but that's like a reflection of your value. And of course, the flip side, when you succeed, you've really earned it, and there's a reason and there's a logic. And of course, that's not the way life actually works. And so many things are unearned and undeserved. But the way she grew up, her parents, especially her father, really kind of instilled that belief system in her. And so she suffers the tragedy of believing in meritocracy and just looking at the world and looking at other people as mirrors to reflect back to her who she is and what she's worth. And so, I think that this is something, again, the reason that I felt really compelled to set this story in college is because I think that is an experience so many of us have, especially when we're young and we haven't quite figured out or grown comfortable with who we are as a person. And we're just constantly comparing ourselves, constantly seeing where we stack up. And so the idea of like Jessica constantly trying to read academic situations, social situations, to figure out where she fits, and then being really unhappy and uncomfortable with what she sees, and then trying so hard to change it. That's a real experience I had, and I know it's a kind of common one. So I really that all went into the character development for Jessica.
I think for a book like this too, for a psychological thriller, you need a more complicated main character and even a complicated set of secondary characters. If your main character is very, very simple and straightforward, you don't really have a psychological thriller, because it's presumably that main character is just going to confess to everything and not have those dark places.
Yes, exactly. Amen. Thank you.
So talk a little bit more about the character development that you like to do. Do you have a pretty good idea? Like, it sounds like Jessica came pretty fully formed, but how about other characters that you've written? Do you tend to have a pretty good character sketch before you start writing, or do your characters develop as you write the story?
Oh, yes. I am one of those very type A, very meticulous. I'm going to plot everything out in as minute detail as possible. I'm going to do all the character work before I ever start drafting. And I'm actually just completely obsessed with Story Genius by Lisa Cron as my tool for character development. I just think it's if you haven't heard of it, it's a brilliant craft book. It takes a kind of neurological science, like a brain science approach, to try to figure out what it is that people find compelling in fictional characters, and then helps writers kind of work through the steps of crafting a character who's compelling. So I use Story Genius, in everything I write. And this, I don't know what I was thinking with such a large ensemble cast of 7+ characters, because I had to do the Story Genius method on all of them, and that took quite a while. But it was worth it. So I did so much what I call character mapping, where I started, of course, with Jessica and actually Heather Shelby as my two anchor characters. And I really got to know them, wrote a lot about them, not, superficial stuff like birthday, favorite color, but that stuff you actually really want to know to get to know a person, like what is it they want most in the world? What is their fundamental misbelief? And so I figured those characters out. And then I started working on the rest of the friend group, the East House 7. And I was not only looking for, them to each stand on their own and have their own stories and their own desires that were as deeply, fiercely held as Jessica and others. But I knew I wanted them to tie to Jessica and Heather in two ways. So I set up 2 rules for myself with the character development. One, that every character, Mint, Frankie, Coop, Jack, Caro, Courtney, and so on, would represent something that Jessica wanted desperately but couldn't have, whether it was wealth, natural beauty, popularity, just a kind of natural comfort, talent, smarts, whatever it is, something that she wanted. And that in turn, each of the characters would want something themselves that Heather threatened. And I knew that I needed that to make, for a lot of credible suspects as to who could have killed her. So I set a lot of rules for myself, but then just wrote essentially like a really, really long Word doc where I went through and worked on the relationship and described to myself the relationship between each of the characters, Jack and Frankie, Coop and Jack, and so on. And not a lot of those details didn't make it into the book, but I had them in the back of my head, and I hoped at least that they would contribute to kind of a richer sense of the characters. So yes, lots of character work.
I feel like pantsers everywhere are deeply uncomfortable with this conversation right now.
Yes. I mean, I'm deeply uncomfortable with it because every time I'm like, why do you do this to yourself?
Everyone's process is different.
True.
How about research? Do you tend to go down rabbit holes of research as well?
I have for my subsequent books, but for this one, I will say that I revisited my Freud. I went back and read, Freud's 5 essays on psychoanalysis, and a lot of Civilization and Its Discontents, and a lot of other writings of his, because one of the things that I was trying really hard to play with in this book is the idea of repression and also repetition compulsion. So I was, also how we like form societies by ostracizing, like through the method of exclusion, bonds are created. And I know that like actual psychologists are probably deeply uncomfortable right now hearing me like refer to Freud as someone I looked to for guidance on this. But in grad school, he's actually a really big figure in literary theory, kind of just treating his ideas and writings almost as like theory and lit. And so I returned back to him for that. But I will say I set this book at the like height of the Great Recession, at least the past timeline when they're in college. And that was, I could draw on my own experience of what it felt like to graduate when the stock market crashed and everyone's jobs went away, and it felt like up was down and everything was topsy-turvy. So I did that, and I also set the book. I was very determined to set the book at a so-called Southern Ivy, which was a kind of college that I was familiar with and had visited others as well. So I drew on a lot of experience, and of course did more research to make sure that everything I remembered about these schools was actually accurate. And one last thing I did, which was I highly do not recommend for anyone, is I jumped on the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, and pulled up the old Juicy Campus website. And for anyone not familiar with what Juicy Campus was, it was this anonymous internet forum that popped up around 07, 08, 09. And it was for colleges. Like each college campus had its own dedicated forum, and students and others could post anonymously about each other. And so all the bad things that you can imagine happening happened. People did rankings of like the hottest girls / least attractive girls / easiest girls, and it was mostly girl focused, as these things usually are. But anyway, I went back to kind of look at this, because one thing I was really interested in between setting it in the Great Recession and 08, 09 was just this feeling of like things are already competitive for these college students. They're at this Southern Ivy, but I wanted to tighten the screws even more. And so, you've got the competition is heightening with the fact that the opportunities are diminishing. And then also this sense, which I really did feel at the time, which, was that life was becoming more and more of a fishbowl, because my first year of college, I graduated in '08, but my first year in '04 was when Facebook started. It was, thefacebook.com. And so I went to college at the very beginning of like the social media explosion. And so there was just this really interesting experience of feeling like you were being looked at in different ways than I had experienced before. So all of that I was trying to kind of like capture in the setting of the book. But beyond that, not the heavy research I've done for books following.
So it's time for our second break of the podcast, but I do have to say that I started college in January of 1996, and I was just really excited to get my very first email address. I mean, that's aging myself, yes, but social media was not a thing when I was in college, and we're going to talk more about that when we come back. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As a reminder, before the break, Ashley was talking about the setting of the book, the time setting of the book being in 2008, and the role social media played in the characters' lives, and in the fact that social media was just kind of really starting to take hold and made a difference in the storyline. So let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
I cannot tell you how grateful I am that social media did not exist when I went to college.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I mean, I wasn't that crazy of a kid or of a person, but still really happy that it didn't exist.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that it was only the Facebook. Why do I call it the Facebook?
The Facebook?
I'm so grateful that it was only that and not the absolute plethora of Instagram and Twitter. And I just don't know what I would have done.
Yeah, and everything being filmed all the time.
Everything being filmed all the time. It just it makes me uncomfortable now, and I can't imagine what I would have felt like at 22 or 20 when your ego boundaries you're impressionable and you have weak boundaries and blah blah blah.
You're trying to figure out yourself anyway, and then no, thank you. So you've written in a variety of genres, as you said. What about this one as being a psychological thriller? What about this genre you think draws you to writing this type of book?
I actually think that this might be my favorite genre to write in. I didn't expect that to be true. But I love the pacing. I love writing fast-paced books. It feels like it's a natural suit for my personality. I guess I'll confess that I tend to be a very intense, dramatic person. And so I constantly have to check myself when I'm writing other genres like romance, oh, we don't need to be angsty and dramatic and intense all the time. People are going to be reading this for a break from those things maybe, but that's just my natural resting state. So it lends itself really well to the way you tell thriller stories. And I'm interested. fundamentally in like who we are under all the layers of pretense and just how complicated human beings are. And I like exposing dark impulses and dark desires. And those things tend to lend themselves, interests tend to lend themselves really well to thrillers, especially psychological thrillers. But I will say, when I started writing in my dreams, I was coming off having worked for years on a contemporary YA fantasy. And when I started writing it, I didn't necessarily know that I was writing a thriller, but it became very apparent after I wrote a few chapters that that's what I was doing, and that this was the only way that this particular story I had in mind could be told. And I also wrote it in a very, I wrote in my dreams, I swear, like hunched over my laptop, breathing heavily, typing as fast as I could. It was this strange physical, like psychosomatic, like everything that Jessica was and the other characters are experiencing in the book, I felt like I was living it. And so I tend to get that kind of connection to thrillers more often than any other genres. So yeah, I love to write thrillers. I hope I get to do it for a long time.
I love it. A little concerned about maybe your physical health after writing it, but
as is my husband, let me assure you.
Get up, stretch, drink some water.
He's always like, "Oh my gosh, please start drafting a romance. I need Happy Ashley."
Okay, I have a question, and it might be dumb, and it might be just overly literal, but the book is In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, and the cover has a scissor on it.
Yes, this is my most frequent question.
Okay, okay.
No, I love it. And it's kind of funny because the original title of the book was East House 7. I was like, oh, great, straightforward. It's the name of the group of friends in the book. Maybe I was like trying to do a little Leanne Moriarty thing, Monterey 5. And one of the first things that my editor said after I sold the book was, you can do better in terms of a title. Like, give me something evocative, like go somewhere poetic and charged. And I really took that seriously. And she also told me to just lob title options at her. So being the type A human that I am, I really I ran with it. I came up with hundreds of titles, still have them in a Word doc. Some of them are so hilarious. I like to go back and look at it and laugh at myself that I would ever consider showing another human being, especially a publishing professional, that idea. But I sent her all of these options and nothing was really resonating with her. And so, in a kind of frustrated state, I did a reread of my manuscript. And I remembered something that I'd been trying to do while writing it, which was create this sort of sense of a sword of Damocles hanging over Jessica's head, and this sort of invisible menace, And I tried to do that by describing her very frequently with knife imagery, her heels stabbed in the grass, jealousy knifed her in the gut, just over and over again. Probably I was heavy-handed with it. But I kept trying to do that to really escalate this sense of both Jessica's guilt, but also her menace, because a large part of the arc of the book is, coming to suspect Jessica of having done things, quite terrible things. And so I saw what I had been doing or trying to do with the way I described her and the sort of invisible menace, and also the way I was trying to work with the idea of dreams and the subconscious and your subterranean self, and how that can very subconsciously wield power over what you do and say. And In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife kind of came to me as a literary metaphor for Jessica's guilt and her ambition and her menace. So I included that to my editor, and out of all the hundreds of titles I sent her, she was like, that's the one. That is the one. And so I got really excited that we landed on a title, we announced it, we went into the cover process. And we went through so many iterations of different covers. Let me tell you, that was quite a process. And when I finally saw the final cover sent to me in my inbox, I knew immediately that it was the one. It was so beautiful. So yes, this is wonderful. Then about a day later, it hit me. I was like, wait a second. It's going to say, in my dreams, I hold a knife, but then there's going to be like the scissors literalized on the cover. And so I sent my editor this email and I was like, Shayna, do you think this is going to confuse anyone? That, we're suggesting, one, I'm not meaning to suggest like a murder weapon, but that people might think that and like look for a knife in the book, in more literal ways. She was like, no. Like people absolutely get literary metaphors and that titles can be metaphorical. And I thought, okay, well, she knows better than me. And let me tell you that has been enormously confusing for so many readers. And I like it, actually. I feel guilty even admitting it, but I like it because it's a real big conversation starter. So I get to kind of like always dive into the book and what I was trying to do with Jessica. But I have since circled back to my editor and I've been like, I think we're going to avoid titles like that, or at least like confusing people with the title and the image on the cover.
Okay, so maybe one or the other, literary metaphor in the title, but then
Yeah.
more literal representation on the cover.
Right. We're not going to let those things compete with each other on the cover and just confuse a whole heck of a lot of people.
I love it, though.
I mean, it's just one of those things. You live and you learn.
Exactly. And like you said, it's a good conversation starter.
Yes.
Can you talk about anything that you're working on currently?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm actually working on book 5 and 6 now. No, 4 and 6. Because I had the great good fortune of it having a lot of runway between when In My Dreams sold and it came out. And so in that amount of time that I had, I wrote 2 new books. One is my romance debut that's actually coming out in April 2022. And the other is my second thriller, which will be out in August 2022. So I have 2 books coming out next year. So I wrote those before Dreams ever even saw, the light of day and people were reading it. So I feel grateful that I think I skirted the sophomore slump in that way, because for the next 2 books, I didn't have the world's voice in my head. I wasn't feeling that high pressure situation where, oh, I know what people think of Dreams and whether they love it or hate it. Now I'm kind of responding to it in some way in my work, because that has certainly hit me now. And it's something that I'm like grappling with on a daily basis. But right now I am writing the second romantic comedy. So it's in the same universe as the first. And it is by far the most tender, soft-hearted, romantic thing I've ever written. And I am also working on what I hope will be my 3rd thriller / 6th book, which is a dark fairy tale-esque serial killer murder mystery set in Louisiana. So it is quite interesting to switch between those 2 manuscripts.
I was just thinking that. I'm actually now a little concerned about your husband. Which Ashley does he get on a moment-to-moment basis?
Oh, yes. He could probably do his own podcast with you, Sarah, just to talk, just to explain that experience. But I will say it was kind of funny when my romance sold, and it's a very zany, like, I compare the humor to Trainwreck and, Fleabag, just very messy woman being messy, hopefully in funny ways, and finding love along the way. But I sold it and I had an early meeting with my editor at HarperCollins, and HarperCollins is also my Canadian publisher for Dreams. And so she said, oh, we got the early copies of In My Dreams I Hold the Knife, and, within their imprint, and we were all looking at it. She's like, it sounds so dark. You know, she's like, it sounds just like pitch black dark. She was like, how, I just feel like you're two different people potentially stuffed in that one person. And I thought I was making a joke. And I was like, well, I truly am. There are two people inside of me. And just, I think I delivered it a little bit too stoically, you know, like a little too serious face, because her expression, just her eyes widened and she was just like, oh no, what have I done? Like, I have,
Oh no.
yeah, stumbled into something I didn't want to stumble into. And then, so of course, I had to quickly say, like, just kidding, you know, I just like, you know, experimenting with different kinds of voices and different stories. Just like backpedal as fast as I
Right. Right. I mean, on the one hand, I think we all have those different personalities. So I'm not sure why maybe you really did deliver it much too
can. Yes.
stoically. Because yeah, I mean, you seem to just be personifying it a little more tangibly than some of the rest of us. You know, you've got the light with the romance and the kind of romantic comedy, and the dark with the thrillers. So two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and you're so right. We're all this way. And there's that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote where, I'm going to butcher this, but it's something like, writers aren't people really, or if they are, they're 10 different people trying very hard to be one person. And so that's always resonated with me. And I think it's true not just of writers, but of everyone. But of course, like you said, it does manifest a little more literally for writers writing different kinds of books.
All right, time for our third and final break of the podcast. When we come back, Ashley will be talking a little bit more about her path to publication. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Ashley Winstead.
Your journey to publication has been circuitous, for lack of a better word. But can you talk about, did you always want to write, or did you decide later in life that you wanted to write? How did that kind of form for you?
Yeah, the circuitous is so generous. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. I have wanted to be a writer since I knew, you know, that it was a possible job. I have very early memories of just being fascinated by language and rolling beautiful sentences around in my mind and kind of actually like pacing around in very early elementary school writing assignments, taking them way too seriously and thinking about how if I chose a different word, what it would mean for the sentence. So cursed from an early age to want to do this, and then went to undergrad to try to major in English and creative writing and art history, which I did, and then applied my senior year to a slew of MFA programs because I thought that that's what one did to become a writer. Is that okay? Now I go get educated in higher ed, post-grad, and then I'll start writing novels. And I got just rejected from every single one of those MFA programs, and actually coincided with a really terrible car accident that I was unfortunately in, it took me a long time to recover from, and had to go to physical therapy and kind of relearn how to use my dominant hand. And so it was a hard time for me. And I think all of those things combined to make me really take the blanket rejections hard and do the thing that aspiring writers are never supposed to do, which is just give up. Like say, okay, I hear you. I hear your rejection. This is you telling me that I'm not meant to do this. So like I said, I went off and I did a lot of other things for 10 years. And I really regret that looking back. I wish I had done the opposite and just said like, okay, round one of what's going to end up being a million rejections. I've gotten through that. Time to start round two. I wish I'd persisted because I lost a decade, but I'm trying to make up for it now. And yeah, so I think that's why stories are pouring out of me really quickly now, because when I saved up 10 years worth of ideas and thoughts, and I really didn't start dipping my toe into fiction writing again until after I had defended my dissertation and successfully left my PhD program. And I had this moment where I thought to myself, Ashley, you just spent over a year waking up at 8 a.m. to sit at your desk and write a novel length work, and not ending until like midnight or something. And you taught yourself how to write something this long. What if you applied that to that old dream you used to have and applied that work ethic, but never showed anyone, only for pleasure? Like you're going to write this for yourself because, good Lord, there's no way my ego can handle showing it to the rest of the world and being rejected again. So that's how I started. I had to kind of like persuade myself I was going to do it instead of watching Netflix, simply because it was pleasurable to me. And it really was. And then fast forward a year, and I actually had a book that I'd written in my nights and weekends because it was so enjoyable. And I grew confidence during that writing process until I was actually considering sending it out in the world. So yeah, that's kind of my journey.
And you've given a pretty good foundation or foreshadowing of this answer already, but do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah, other than don't give up and persist, I would say a thing that I grappled with that a lot, and I think it's born out of the fact that I was in academia for so long and really soaked up academic snobbery and the idea that like the only good kind of fiction is highbrow literary fiction and commercial genre fiction is like fine for making money but not art. Like I tried really hard. I would have protested if you had asked me if I thought that, but I think in the back of my mind I did. So I always really struggled between what I really wanted to write, the stories I wanted to tell. Obviously, In My Dreams I Hold a Knife is about like involves Greek life and sorority girls and like young female ambition and desire and anger and things that a lot of people roll their eyes at, to be frank. And I wanted to tell those kinds of stories, but I felt endlessly like it wasn't worthwhile. And I kept trying to make myself fit some sort of other voice and other genre and like write in a literary fiction style. And oh my gosh, if I can save even one writer from trying to force themselves down paths that aren't their natural interests or styles, like obviously there's nothing wrong with highbrow lit fic, but if you want to write soapy, fun, fast-paced stories, like those are just as worthwhile, in my personal opinion, as National Book Award winning, canonical lit fic. And I hold very strongly to that. So I would just say, like, lean into who you are. Get rid of all shame and just own your unique contribution and interests.
Well, I love that. And yeah, I think that's I think a lot of people probably need to hear some variation of that. So thank you. When you take the time to read for yourself rather than for research, what genres and authors are you drawn to?
I love romance. And I really, I gobble up mysteries and thrillers as well, but I will say that romance has been my go-to the last year and a half, 2 years. How long have we been in this pandemic? Basically, since the doors shuttered and we all kind of had to be at home. And
I think it's been like 30 years. 30,
yeah, exactly.
40, I'm not sure.
Exactly. So for the last 30 years, I've been on a romance kick, just trying to disappear into worlds that, maybe do deal with heaviness, and it's not like everything's perfect all the time in romance, but at least you have that lovely sense, that conviction, that guarantee that it's going to end up okay. And that has been very cathartic. So I've really just blazed through so many contemporary romances and love everyone from, Emily Henry to Christina Lauren, the pair of writers, to Talia Hibbert and Sally Thorne, and all of these new Rosie Danon, Meryl Wilsner, just so many incredible writers. And now I have the great good fortune of being in the debut group for 2022, since I'm debuting again. And it has allowed me to beg debut romance authors for arcs of their books. And I've read so many upcoming contemporary romances for 2022. And the talent that's coming for the world is just incredible. There's so many great books coming out.
Well, that's exciting. And I love your answer because of the way it ties into your previous answer, about the more literary types of writing. And those are necessary and needed during some times. But then there's other times where you have a pandemic that lasts for 2 years and you need romance, you need beach reads, you need fiction that can help take you out of the crazy and sometimes blah, for lack of a better word, reality that exists.
Yes, it's a gift. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Website and social media, where can people find you?
Yes, I am at ashleywinstead.com is my website. And then Instagram, which I'm a little more active on, is Ashley Winstead Books, and Twitter, which I really try not to check very often. So with that caveat, is just at Ashley Winstead.
Okay, Twitter time suck, is that the problem, or just
it's like both the time suck, and I just feel like Twitter is a pit of negativity,
divisiveness? Yeah.
Yes, I find myself becoming so saddened every time I check Twitter, and I was like, why are you doing this to yourself? Whereas I know Instagram isn't perfect and there's plenty to say about it, but I just feel like the general atmosphere is kinder. And so that's where I like to spend more of my time.
The trolls used to live under bridges and fairy tales, and now I think they live on Twitter.
Yes, that is so accurate. Yes, that's amazing.
Well, I would like to thank you then for taking the time to talk to me. I know we both had some scheduling issues, so thanks for hanging in there with me. But thank you so much for talking to me, not only about In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, but about your other writings as well. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Sarah, this is such a joy. I had such a blast talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you once again to Ashley for a delightful conversation. I also want to say thank you to Ashley for the answer to one of my first questions of, the inspiration for this book and how this book came to be, being so open and vulnerable with the failure that she experienced and how that affected her, and how she created this book out of that seeming failure, out of that sense of failure. I think that can happen a lot in life, and we don't always want to talk about what seems to be a negative in terms of failure, and yet sometimes some really beautiful things come out of those experiences. And so it doesn't negate the feelings that we had during the times of failure or rejection or whatever it is, but it can help to frame those experiences in a slightly different light and help to see how every experience brings us to where we are now. So just thank you to Ashley for being so open and being willing to share exactly how hard this book was to birth, how hard this book was to bring to fruition. So thank you again to Ashley. Thank you as always to you, my listeners. I hope that you are, again, having a great week and you have some good weekend plans. I hope you will join me for Tuesday's episode. I have another returning author. Author Paul Russell Semendinger is coming back to the podcast. We talked about his debut novel on his last interview, but now his next book is actually a nonfiction book, and it is called The Least Among Them. It has a baseball theme. I'm going to have you tune in to that episode, though, to find out more about that book. But if you're a fan of baseball, you're definitely going to want to tune in for my conversation with Paul. Again, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the favor of writing a review or leaving a starred review at the very least. Also follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I would love to interact with you, hear what you have to say, hear what you're reading, hear what your holiday plans are. This time of year is chock full of holidays, so love to hear all about what's going on. Oh, and what books you're reading that are related to those holidays. If you are reading any Hanukkah books right now, happy Hanukkah to those of you who are celebrating it. If I'm counting right, tonight is the 6th night of Hanukkah, so happy Hanukkah, and I hope that you are spending time with family and experiencing all of the traditions that your family has around this holiday. But again, if you have any books that are set during Hanukkah if you have any books that are set during Hanukkah, I would love to hear about them, especially romance. I love romance books that are set during certain times of year. So let me know, but also just let me know what you're reading and, if you've read any of the books from the authors that have been on the podcast and what you thought. I really love hearing from listeners. So thank you very much for joining me. Join me again on Tuesday. Hope you have some fun weekend plans, and I hope that those plans include plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.